I've got a couple of questions for you. Can God create a rock so heavy that he can't lift it? And why isn't Frank Turek capable of recognizing what this question actually means? No theist is, to be fair, so when I pick on Frank Turek because Frank is such an easy target, it's not really personal. He's just dumb. And this is yet another video to prove it. So here we go. If there's one thing that has become painfully clear, it's that the religious aren't good at follow-through. They'll get really close to realizing how wrong they are, only to turn back at the precipice because it gets too emotionally uncomfortable. Today, Frank Turek shows why reason gets in the way of blind faith. The more you mess with the religious formula, the less well it works for anyone. This is why poking at the cracks of theology with the stick is so effective. Sooner or later, something has to give.
So when I would assume, I haven't read Jeremiah 32 on this, but I would assume what it means there is that things that are normally impossible with human beings, God can do, but even God can't violate his own nature.
Now, I know that this is Frank's new shtick, where he starts off with something that will show up later in the video, but it always feels wrong to say something, knowing I'll just have to ignore it later in context. So, this time, I'm going to do it the other way around. I'm not going to address his crap up front, I'll hit it in the back end in context. Now, you might ask yourself why I don't just cut this out, and I'll tell you. Because I always show the whole video, except maybe for the begging parts in the end. You know, the self-congratulatory, subscribe to me bits. Because I don't want anyone accusing me of presenting anything pulled out of context. I try to make sure that I'm responding properly. So this time, I'm doing it the other way. Anyway, let's get back to it, shall we?
I just have a question on something you said that there are some things which God simply can't do, like some things are impossible for God himself. But according to Jeremiah chapter, what is this?
And you notice that this guy's hand is shaking if you look at his phone. He's really nervous talking to Frank. I don't know why, but he is. Now, I'd be trying not to laugh. Frank really is a joke. But since I'm not there, we'll just go with what this guy asks. The thing that most people don't recognize is that we, the logical and the skeptical, are pointing out that the arbitrary characteristics that the religious staple onto their deities, they really don't work well together when you think about it. That's the whole point. They made up a bunch of indemonstrable characteristics that don't play well together. It's why things like the problem of evil work so well. When you take one boldly asserted characteristic that they pulled straight out of their asses and combine it with another boldly asserted characteristic, and it's painfully clear where they pulled that one out of too, it's really obvious that they simply don't mesh well together. It leaves people like Frank scrambling to explain why it's fine and why you shouldn't think about it too deeply. Because these people, they don't think at all. But let's get back to the question.
Jeremiah 32 verse 27, it says that, "Behold, I'm the Lord, the God of all flesh. Is there anything too hard for me?"
Yeah, and that's the problem that theists really have. All of the stories in the Bible, they were written by individuals who didn't have to worry about what anyone else was saying. They just spewed their individual insanity and left it at that. Now, modern-day apologists, They have to take all of that random stupidity and somehow make some kind of sense of it, and it doesn't really work. That's why the Bible is so filled with contradictions. Contradictions that people like Frank have to try to explain away because their theology demands that they do. Frank is like a little Dutch boy trying to stick his finger in a dike full of holes. Everywhere he goes, it just keeps getting worse. It keeps leaking more. He can't just admit that the Bible is wrong. That goes against his blind faith. So he has to find some way to make something up so that the contradictory crap in the Bible looks at least reasonable if you don't look too close. But we whip out our magnifying glasses and the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. It's funny how that works.
And another scripture as well, Luke 18:27 says, and he said, the things which are impossible with men are possible with God. So I want to know your take on these scriptures, since you say that there are some things which are simply impossible for God.
And the only reason they're impossible for God is because Frank is busy juggling a billion balls in the air. If Frank could be rational, and yeah, I know this is Frank we're talking about, but if he could and admit that all of these independent, individual writers just recording their own beliefs, if he could admit that the conception of God is all just made up and all of the characteristics that he holds dear are just artificially attached because they've made various groups of irrational people feel good over the years, then maybe he'd have a chance. Maybe. Instead, he's just trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again using parts from 66 individual Humpty Dumptys that were never intended to match up. That's the task in front of apologists like Frank. It's why they never do very well.
Well, we'd have to look at the context of those passages. And when we say that things that are impossible with humans can be possible with God, we're not talking about logically impossible things, because God is the ground of logic, so he can't violate his own nature.
And now we're back to Frank's opening. I just have to ask, says who? Who says that's God's nature? How do you know that? And how have you tested your assertions to find out if it's actually true? That's where this whole thing starts to fall apart, when the religious start to make claims about things that they have absolutely no means to verify at all. It's all feelings, no facts. It just makes them feel good to think that God is this way, so that's how they arbitrarily define God. Well, how do they know that's what God is actually like? How do they know that God actually exists to begin with? They don't know, and they don't care. It simply doesn't matter.
I mean, if God could violate logic, he could both exist and not exist at the same time and in the same sense, right?
And if God was truly omnipotent, he could do that. In fact, by denying that he can do that, you are proving that God can't be truly omnipotent. And this has only really become a problem for the religious in the modern world. When people were largely uneducated and ignorant, they didn't stop to think about these things. Of course God could do anything, because their imaginations were limited. They didn't think of these things, and they weren't trying to consider the ramifications of their beliefs somewhat logically, I guess. But today, believers are realizing that, hey, that sounds kind of stupid. And that leaves people like Frank in a position that they have to explain their way around that. God is all-powerful, but only if we diminish what it means by all-powerful. He's all-knowing, but only if we accept that God can't know everything. It's an attempt to put God in a box so that modern believers can go back to feeling good and handing over their money to the apologists. That is what this is all about, after all.
Jesus could have resurrected and not resurrected at the same time and in the same sense.
It's certainly possible. That's what happens when you allow miracles and an all-powerful deity. When you claim your God can violate the laws of nature, well, where does that end? How far do you allow your God to go? And note, it's Frank telling his gullible audience how far God can go. It's not going out to find out what God can actually do. Because God, from every shred of evidence that we can find, isn't real. It's a figment of Frank's imagination. And that's the point that the non-religious are making, and people like Frank, they just don't get it.
So logic isn't invented by God. Logic flows from his nature.
How does that work exactly? Because it's the belief of Christians that God created everything. Now, I've pointed this out before, but it makes sense to reiterate it here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It went from absolutely nothing to absolutely everything, kind of like a reverse Thanos, do the snap. Not only did this magical God create all of the stuff, but he must have also created all of the concepts for the stuff. Before God could create light, he must have created the concept of what that light was. What did it mean to have light? This really becomes a problem for the religious when you think about it. Let's go back to the problem of evil. If God had to create all of the concepts, then why in the world did he create the concept of evil? Why did he create the concept of sin? Why did he invent death? Now, the religious like to pretend that it was for our free will, but that makes no sense at all. Free will is just the ability to freely choose from among a range of available options. You don't lack free will because you can't choose to flap your arms and fly away. That simply isn't one of the options available to you. Therefore, if God had created the world without sin and death and pain and evil, we'd still have the same amount of free will that we supposedly have today. So God must have done this on purpose, or God is a complete idiot. Pick one. Explain your answer.
So I would assume, I haven't read Jeremiah 32 on this, but I would assume what it means there is that things that are normally impossible with human beings, God can do, but even God can't violate his own nature.
And how do you know that? How do you know what God's nature actually is? Because if God can't violate his own nature, then by definition, he can't be all-powerful. That requires that God can do anything. Anything at all, even things that are completely contradictory. It just means you have to whittle down God because the classical definitions of God just don't work anymore. But how is that a thing? Because truth doesn't stop being truth because it becomes confusing or inconvenient. The speed of light doesn't change because people start asking inconvenient or difficult questions. It is what it is. Perhaps our understanding of it might change as we find inconsistencies, but reality is what it is, period. And that's where a lot of this starts to become a problem for the religious. Remember, Christianity isn't supposed to change. The Bible is the inerrant word of God, and if you start throwing out the Bible, you just throw out Christianity as a whole. Remember, 42,000 distinct sects, and that's how this crap happens. Everyone is trying to throw their own spin on it, and it stops being about the truth, and it starts being about their own personal interpretations. And if there's that many interpretations, there's something severely wrong.
He couldn't go out of existence, for example. He couldn't lie.
No. That's just another demonstration of the futility of the characteristics that you've grafted onto God. If God is all-powerful, then he can create anything, including a rock so heavy that he himself can't lift. But if he's all-powerful, he can lift anything. It's an inherent contradiction. You can't have it both ways. It's meant to show how absurd the idea of omnipotence actually is. And the religious apologist just says, hey, hold my beer. They don't understand the reality of why this question is being asked. They just take the problem as a challenge to work around.
He couldn't make a rock so big he couldn't lift it.
Says who? I mean, for us, that is true, but this is God we're talking about. God is supposed to be able to do anything. Anything at all. Well, he is until it gets to you people, and then you're just going to start neutering your all-powerful super being because people are starting to point out uncomfortable problems with your beliefs. Instead of admitting that maybe your beliefs are wrong, maybe they're unfounded, maybe you need to go back to the drawing board, you'd rather just run around with the goalposts and pretend that you had it right all along. If only you just change your understanding of what these words actually mean. With God, all things are possible, right up until people start thinking about it and start realizing just how problematic that actually is. Now, God can only do the things that you can rationalize him doing. It's a lot easier than just being honest, isn't it?
Why? Because a rock, when somebody says, can God make a rock so big he can't lift it? You got to ask him, how big is the rock? And the person's going to say, big. You go, how big is big? Really big. How big is really big? Infinitely big. Now, what has that person just done? He's actually transgressed into what logicians call a category mistake. You can't have an infinitely big, finite rock, right?
Are you saying that God couldn't create an infinite rock, or a boundless rock, or whatever? I mean, this God of yours supposedly created the entire universe out of nothing, and now you're going to put limitations on your deity. Are you out of your mind? Don't answer that. We already know the answer. Don't worry.
Any rock is finite by definition. It has boundaries. So you can't have an infinite finite rock. It's got to be any rock that God can make, God can move. But he can't make a logically impossible rock an infinite finite rock. It doesn't exist.
Then God doesn't exist. At least the God that you've defined into existence. The God with all of those silly characteristics that are logically inconsistent. So now you've got a God that's not all powerful, not all knowing, and not all good. Why would anyone in their right mind ever follow your God? It's a self-defeating effort. You start out with a God that is huge so that people will bow down to it. Then you have to keep whittling away at your concept of God because the concept itself makes no sense. It really doesn't. But people like Frank, because they've got to be up on that stage night after night after night, they have to keep arguing that God isn't this giant thing that can do absolutely anything, because Frank keeps getting these logical questions to what is a fundamentally illogical concept. Religion is fundamentally illogical. You can't have it both ways. But in the end, Frank and his ilk have diminished God down to something that's not worth following at all. What's next? If someone points out that it's fundamentally irrational to think that God created everything from nothing, will Frank just admit that God couldn't have created the universe? Are we going for theistic evolution? How about it was all purely naturalistic from the Big Bang, but, God had something to do with it? I don't know. It'll be some stupid shit that Frank makes up. Because I don't see an end to this. I really don't. At some point, you have to admit that there's no reason to believe in a God at all. Then you come over to our side, which is a good thing because we've long since realized that God is an entirely unnecessary and indefensible belief. From a religious standpoint, and from any standpoint really, everything that Frank says, every single thing that comes out of his mouth is complete bunk. He's doing our work for us. He's just so blind that he can't see it. And neither can his audience, but someday, I don't know, a light bulb might go off over their heads, and then Frank will be left without a job. And that's going to be a wonderful day, isn't it? I might even have to throw a party.
Boom, dicky, 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 bum.